Welcome everyone to the morning's webinar, the Supply Chain for Economic Developers, Understanding North Carolina's Competitive Advantage. This is the second of a three-part professional development series sponsored by the North Carolina State Port Authority. Again, I'm Josh Hollingsy. I chair the NCEDA Professional Development Committee and coming to you live from Carolina Beach this morning. It's my duty to kick things off today. The grand opening earlier this month of the Carolina Connector in Rocky Mountain sparked renewed interest in North Carolina's supply chain economy. Modern multimodal transportation infrastructure, along with a strong manufacturing base and convenient access to markets, make North Carolina a prominent player in value-added logistics. From basic materials to life-saving medications, we make and ship products needed by businesses and consumers worldwide. Dana Magliola, Freight and Logistics Program Manager with North Carolina Department of Transportation, joins us today to pick up where we left off on September 14th, and he'll take over the virtual platform in a moment. But first, let me thank our sponsors. Our annual sponsors stand with NCEDA and its professional development mission year-round. Have a look at the names and logos now. Our sincere appreciation goes out to all these organizations and companies. A 2016 study by North Carolina State University found that our supply chain economy accounted for more than 1.2 million jobs. Supply chains contributed over $150 billion in gross domestic product and generated more than $32 billion in state and federal tax revenues that year. Deepwater ports in Morehead City and Wilmington are both key links in that supply chain. Ben Mesa from the North Carolina State Port Authority, our presenting sponsor, has a few words regarding the ports. Ben is Senior Director of Carrier and Trade Development at the North Carolina Port Authority. After his overview, he will introduce our presenter. I'll turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. As Josh said, my name is Ben Massa. I am the North Carolina State Ports Authority Senior Director for Carrier and Trade Development. I reside here in Wilmington, North Carolina. As Senior Director, I manage the global relationship between NC Ports and the ocean container carriers. It's NC's Ports' mission to grow and support international commerce for the stakeholders of the state of North Carolina. As Josh mentioned, we're comprised of two deepwater ports, one here in Wilmington, where we handle all modes of cargo, including containers, break bulk, and bulk cargoes. The other deepwater facility is in Morehead City, where we handle all cargoes except containers. We also have an inland port facility in Charlotte that is connected to Wilmington via an on-dock overnight rail service. NC Port is a major economic engine for the state of North Carolina. We directly and indirectly generate over 87,000 jobs throughout the state and have an economic contribution of over $15 billion. Wilmington connects NC importers and exporters with over 96 ports in 60 different countries. I'd also like to say at this time, we're very much looking forward to the NCEDA's next function, which will be held here in Wilmington with a port tour on Tuesday, November 16th. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dana Magliola. Dana is the Program Manager of Freight and Logistics within the North Carolina Department of Transportation and Rail Division. Connecting industry and commerce to infrastructure investment, the Office of Freight and Logistics is active across the spectrum of NCDOT projects, delivering solutions from planning to construction. Dana joined the Department of Transportation in 2018 from NC State University, where he led the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative at Poole College of Management and was the Supply Chain Management subject matter expert for NC State's Industrial Extension Service. He's the primary author on the Foundational Supply Chain Sector Economic Impact Analysis, North Carolina's Supply Chain Conduit for Commerce. Good morning, Dana.
Hey, good morning, Ben. Thank you for the kind introduction and thanks for having me. And thank you to NCEDA for putting on this great session with the support of the ports. It's fun to talk about supply chain. And right before we got on, I think we had a little chat about it. So we're going to dive right back into things where we picked up. I'm going to go ahead and start to share some slides here. Bear with me, and then we'll get going. As mentioned, please feel free to jump in on the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it, but we'll hopefully have some time for some questions as well. All right, again, it is great to be back with you. I hope you've had a little bit of time between our last session. You know, one of the things I enjoyed was meeting many of you at the NCEDA conference in Greensboro. I feel like it was maybe last week. All my weeks are running together right now. But getting in person, and what a great conference. I think I'm still find myself inspired by Dr. Cobain's presentation, that keynote. I also hope you found yourself sort of tuned in to the supply chain, you know, starting to listen a little bit more on what you're hearing in the media, and you sure are hearing a lot these days, but noticing it around you. And of course, it becomes ubiquitous once you start noticing and thinking about it. Again, my name is Dana Magliola. I run the Freight and Logistics program here at DOT, and we really have a cross-modal mission. This is a little bit of my background here, which you heard from Ben, but today we're going to really look at a holistic supply chain. So bringing in all kinds of modes, how they interact with transportation, and most importantly for your audience, how this connects to economic development. I wanted to sort of, again, start with what are we here to do? And what we're really here to do is to bring you through different parts of the supply chain, from concept to practice. And through that, hopefully you strengthen your confidence and familiarity with the supply chain and your vocabulary to go out there and brag about North Carolina's competitive advantage. So here's a quick look at what we'll cover today. We'll start quickly with a deep dive in supply chain management, really the core of the study of supply chain. And then we'll get into procurement, production, distribution, look at the relationship between inventory and working capital. I know this is sounding like an exciting business lecture here that's coming up, but I promise to keep it moving. We'll then go to distribution, talk a little bit about the relationships and decisions that companies make and where that may cross paths with your site selection world. We'll get to know your mode. We'll talk about what each one of the modes sort of offers, where they're relevant in the transportation portfolio, and just how their and how their relevance to the overall supply chain matters. And really, you know, this meme captures it. 2020, the 2020s so far, the supply chain has just been a house on fire, and all the while we're going to try and get used to fixing that and adapting. So I think we're all familiar with hype cycles. You know, I've got two on here: the emerging technology cycle from Gartner, and then there's this novel panic privacy with new technologies. I'd like to introduce a new hype cycle, and this is one that I'm sure everybody is tuned into. You know, you turn up literally today. I looked online and I pulled up the cover of the New York Times. There's a container port. So they're talking about, you know, supply chain topics. Supply chain panic on Fortune magazine, and probably the most important local reporting I've seen here out of Lake Charles, Louisiana, that national alcohol shortages may reignite panic buying. So wait till the end of my presentation to go hit the ABC store. But again, we're in a panic, right? And I'd like to introduce the supply chain panic hype cycle, because I think this is just my view of what's going on, and hopefully will give you a sense of kind of context when you get back into these articles. The novel bump down, you know, oh, the novel lockdown bump. We're locked in, this is cute for a couple weeks, right? Then it was like real, and the height of the pandemic, and that's where you saw toilet paper and everybody went crazy. Longer term, you started to see things sell out like boats and RVs, because people had the means to get outside and recreate when they should have been locked in. Spend money on boats. You can't get boats or RVs, you know, back ordered for months. Semiconductors, you know, you're starting to see the industrial impacts of supply chain disruption. I'd even say that in the boats and RV section, you're seeing it with things input like foam and metal products. Then we all remember sort of running out of gasoline in the Southeast. That's another set of supply chain panic. And right now, You look back, you look at the front page of the newspaper, and everything is on panic. We've got 100 ships waiting at LA Long Beach. We've got retailers over purchasing to stock shelves, and we're getting that kind of whip effect, the whiplash effect on the supply chain here. So we're panicking about everything. I think that will go away, but I think that the discussion around supply chain, maybe this hype cycle will be a good way to articulate it. Now let's get into sort of the key focus areas today within supply chain management, really the study of and practice of supply chain operations. This is a quick overview. We're going to take a deeper dive into the processes and activities that make up procurement, production, and then distribution. And as always, I'll try and reconnect it back to the concepts of economic development. Procurement, to start off with, is the process of getting materials, goods, and services that a company needs to successfully fulfill its purpose, whether that is manufacturing or service related. The activities that make up procurement include supplier and material sourcing. Forecasting is one way that we determine how much to purchase, determine what the demand for the product will look like, and then what kind of materials and services do you need to procure upstream of that production. Supplies and services come from vendors when not managed in-house, and making sure that the vendor can deliver what they say. And then negotiating. Negotiation, of course, something I do regularly with my 6-year-old, has supply chain applications. And we'll discuss it as a key objective to negotiate favorable terms, agreements. Really, the supply chain sustainability from a profit standpoint, from an operation standpoint, starts with balanced negotiation. Contracting, once you've negotiated, you contract, you agree to move forward as a partner. And that partnership is something you'll hear from me as we talk about supply chain quite often. Purchasing, it might sound like procurement, but literally purchasing is a step in that procurement process. Cost control, knowing what things should cost, why they cost what they do, and then how to make sure that they're factoring in all of the costs. We'll talk a lot about landed costs, not just what does a product cost or an input to your manufacturing process. What's it cost to get it in the door, across the loading dock? Then there's a lot of different moving parts and things like that that add to the cost. And then quality, contract compliance leads into quality. And as they say, you pay for quality once. And that may generally be the case in the supply chain, but we're going to spend a little bit more on supplier sourcing because I think that's the most relevant. So more than just procuring raw materials, getting the best price that you can to maximize your margins, your successful supply chain organizations develop a strategic sourcing partnership. This is more than just a vendor relationship that can often make or break profitability or long-term success. If you think about the difference between a transaction and a relationship requires communication and understanding that a mere transaction doesn't. In a strategic sourcing partnership, getting into the details and understanding each other's business makes it work. Strategic sourcing identifies the supplier who is an ideal fit and one who will be able to serve in the future as you scale up that business. It's not always about cutting costs. That's a goal, but maximizing productivity, profits, and progress is the primary goal of an important or of sort of a well-run supply chain supplier relationship. If we think about this in economic development context, we're determining philosophically if you recruit practices, if your recruit practices strategic sourcing, if that company you want to bring to North Carolina operates this way, you could highlight that supplier base in either your region or statewide across North Carolina and really discuss the relationships that you have and that you've been able to develop with either those suppliers or that sector. You can extend that conversation to highlight that supply chain base for other industries that might be relevant too. So once you kind of understand how that recruited company operates in the supply chain space, you can leverage all of the benefits here in North Carolina. Material sourcing, we're in a great place for material sourcing, whether it's natural resources or something that pops out of our sort of diversified industrial system. And lastly, that diverse supply base, North Carolina has outstanding resources to support vendor diversity, including networks and organizations focused on women-owned, minority-owned, or veteran-owned businesses. So the resources are here in North Carolina, and it's something that you can go out there armed to talk about. Next thing is to consider in procurement is cost. Of course, we'll get back to it quite often, but today's costs, capital, production, and transportation costs. Those are going to be the things we focus on today. Capital costs and investments, they're important for a business to grow. And if they're looking to build or strengthen capabilities or capacity, a lot of factors play into that. Capital costs include real estate, could be a facility purchase or construction. You have to consider zoning, favorable land use policy, equipment and machinery purchase, utilities, access, utility service, utility cost. In these cases, when you have an opportunity to highlight a shovel-ready space with utilities, with right-of-way acquired, to understand or incentivize programs like rail industrial access, bring those into the mix. That can really make the final touch for a perfect site and investment, a capital investment for a firm. So I think understanding that's really important. And with capital investment, having a healthy business banking community willing to support investment, that's a key factor in one in which North Carolina excels. If your recruit is in a manufacturing firm, access to transportation is a vital element for success as well. Controlling production in manufacturing can be one of the most costly and relevant factors for success. For a manufacturer, being able to maximize utilization out of their operation means they have to purchase quality equipment, maintain it, and minimize downtime, or minimize the process of changeover or breakdown. We often talk about a machine is not running, it's costing money. Utilization is the key. In this area, one of the ways that you can sort of support that recruiting conversation is to highlight our support and repair capabilities. Technology and innovation here in North Carolina applied to manufacturing through communities like the community college, through programs like the community college, mechatronics training, or even some of the work that the Manufacturing Extension Partnership does. And although not directly production related, workforce reliability and availability helps to maximize a firm's utilization of the facility. They can't hire to fill the factory, then the factory is dormant. And I know we're hearing a lot of conversation today about labor. And one of the things that you're seeing manufacturing space have to adjust to is the sort of program, decade-long suppression of wages is kind of coming back into the equation as we start to source labor and start to bring people in. And we're finding, a lot of openings that they're having a hard time filling. Reliability of utilities, that's another great strength for North Carolina. We've got electricity, natural gas, propane, all of those things are an important draw for industry. So whether you've got materials or parts inbound, works in progress, or finished products going out, transportation costs are going to be a significant part of the equation. And it helps to understand that the transportation market looks like in your area. I think that's something that you're going to be able to talk to a recruit about, and knowing, do you have volatility of rates across your different modes. This winter we witnessed a lot of rate volatility in the trucking sector. Strains on capacity drove the spot market rate, which is sort of short-term contract, short-term job purchases, drove that way up. Carriers on the contract side are still struggling to remain profitable. So in a temperamental transportation market around trucking, you see things shift to other modes. You see more firms like 3PLs get involved to try and maximize the logistics. We'll discuss a little bit of a firm's supply chain. So up next, we'll talk a little bit about production, the making of things. I think this is one of the most exciting parts of the supply chain and perhaps the largest umbrella of the supply chain. There are several facets of production that we'll focus on here. Things being manufactured, making them better through process improvement. And then you'll find that the process of production is interconnected. So some of these other topics like forecasting, work in process management, and quality, they'll appear in our focus areas elsewhere. So don't think we've left them behind. First, understanding that there are different kinds of manufacturing processes, and understanding what kind of process your recruited business uses will help better tailor your recruiting or your growth strategy if that's a firm that's already active here. Historically, there are 5 key manufacturing processes. A manufacturer would use repetitive manufacturing, which is all about productivity, all about rate of manufacturing. And this means that production lines are making the same thing over and over again. Setup requirements are low, and there's limited need for changeover. So production speeds can be very high. Discrete manufacturing may also use an assembly line or production line, but often customization or diverse product lines, they increase setup variation, the frequency you have to change over that equipment to produce it, and more production in that case means more time in which this process is inefficient if it's not properly managed or properly maintained. Job shop manufacturing, something you may hear very buzzwordish, job shop, but what it really is it's sort of production areas rather than assembly lines. So you're producing smaller batches of customized products. There are workstations organized to suit either a made-to-order or stock products. A job shop process can really sometimes become discrete manufacturing if automation becomes a part of it. Two kinds of process manufacturing: continuous manufacturing, like repetitive, maximizing utilization. That's often used to produce gases, powders, liquids, or slurries, which is a great industrial catch-all. Batch manufacturing is a little bit more like discrete or job shop, where the process utilized is customized by a volume or a facility produces a diverse line of products. The introduction of additive manufacturing or 3D printing has really added a sixth process, but one that's more like pre-automation manufacturer or clothing of shoes. The increasing volume requires adding another machine, or as one might have just added another person and a sewing machine to make more clothing, if that's an understandable analogy. Bear with me, hold on, my Zoom just popped in front of my slide. This sixth process, I think, will disrupt many of the other five as material technology pushes what's possible, and I think it'll be fun to watch. So there's that sixth process. But if we talk about process, then we have to talk about process improvement. Supply chain folks love process improvement. It's borderline jargon. You know, we're going to get into what feels kind of jargony, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these systems, if not just from having heard about them. We may even have a few black belts in the audience. You know, if you think about Six Sigma black belts. That probably most famous of these processes, that Six Sigma, uses data to reduce defects and increase productivity. Kaizen is an Eastern concept, which is more of an organization-wide philosophy of improvement, as is TQM or total quality management. Lean manufacturing seeks to cut out waste, while a system like JIT, just in time, focuses that effort to minimize inventory in the process. Kanban is the material planner's favorite. It's a methodology for managing production flow that can be very popular in a job shop or discrete process, as we discussed, as well as batch manufacturing. And lastly, the theory of constraints is a constant exercise to ferret out inefficiency. And of course, it leads to this combination of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and sort of that bear sharktopus of improvement. Again, like I said, we get a little jargony, but if it's relevant to a manufacturing process, you will see some of these in the companies you recruit. So we'll close out our deep dive on supply chain activities as we get to the final closest to the customer, and that is that to distribution point. Discussing warehousing and transportation a little bit later, as well as material handling. And I'll remind me to tell you guys about my virtual forklift training exercises that I've gotten to do. But we'll talk a little bit about customs and trade management, and something especially important if your recruit is an import or export focused business. One of the fastest growing activities in distribution, driven largely by growth in e-commerce, is reverse and return logistics, and one that I think is really interesting because there's a lot of new ideas and new practices being introduced in that space. So harkening back to our earlier point, you'll hear me refer to a logistics ecosystem. One of the most important areas that many firms deal with is customs and trade management. So for importers, dealing with U.S. Customs, now U.S. Customs and Border Protection, one of the most important activities in their process. And one with significant consequences if it's not managed correctly. delays, fines, and even jail time, are relevant if you don't get this one right. Customs was initially focused on managing the Tariff Act and was organized under the Department of Commerce. That pretty much collected taxes, but following September 11th, they were incorporated into the Department of Homeland Security and shifted their focus on preventing weapons and other terrorism-related activities from impacting U.S. trade and U.S. security, and also collecting taxes. There are several elements of customs and trade management, including working with experts in the field. This is not something a firm will have in-house, meant especially for the larger firms. Customs brokers who understand that process of customs declaration, the nuances of a harmonized tariff schedule, basically the book of how much things cost to bring into the country. And that listing of every kind of thing you might think that's important or associated with a tax or duty rate. Customs and trade management works within those parameters, as well as many of the foreign trade agreements we have. Some of these foreign trade agreements, like the infamous NAFTA, and now essentially NAFTA 2.0 with the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, USMCA, that was, I think, July of last year. These are important changes to the companies that you're recruiting, especially if they're a manufacturer for export or import. There are outstanding professionals in this field who make import and export business accessible to many firms. Of course, perhaps the most famous custom broker of all time is Art Vandelay, importer of latex or chips, some potatoes, some corn, exporter of diapers, and those long matches. I'm sure we're all familiar with Art Vandelay, and unless that's a reference lost on younger viewers. In 2017, return delivery costs were estimated to be $350 billion US, a figure that's steadily increasing and predicted to reach $550 billion by this past year as we start to see the numbers come out. The increase in total return delivery costs tracks the growth in online retailing, and in the United States, retail e-commerce sales increased around 300% between 2009 and 2019, reaching $140 billion US per quarter. Some $550 billion worth of goods each year are returned to e-commerce retailers around the world. That costs their supply chains an estimated $50 billion. So return deliveries, they're no doubt going to continue to grow. Many retailers are adapting to this new reality and increasingly costly exercise. This is not a change that we anticipate seeing passed on to the customer, very much in the way that we've become comfortable with looking at, is this prime, is this free shipping? Very few customers are interested in paying to return that wildly unpopular cost. So there's an opportunity to improve, and businesses are looking to mitigate that cost. Some firms are using changing dynamics in brick and mortar. Retail firms are changing their footprint, yet they're setting up partnerships with the retailers that are active and leveraging those supply chains. 2019, FedEx and Walgreens partnered to allow consumer to drop returns at Walgreens. Amazon, you can return your Amazon package to Kohl's. I've returned things to Kohl's in that method, and it's always busy. And oh, by the way, why not buy something while you're there? Some industry analysts suggest there's between $250 billion and $350 billion in returned e-commerce products laying dormant. That level of inventory in the marketplace is creating a secondary marketplace into the secondhand market. So I think that's another area you'll start to see develop entrepreneurially, and by the essential demand of that secondary market. Yeah, here's a couple pictures here. We call that re-commerce. So one of the most exciting, I'm going to look at the chat, see how we're doing. Okay, thank you, Chad, for the Seinfeld. I appreciate that you're out there. Let's get into the most exciting topic of the day, talking about inventory and working capital. Now, if I'm in a classroom, I'll usually hear the moans and groans. So you feel free to do that on your own there in the audience. This really isn't a discussion of that. It's a discussion of liquidity. And not to give you a flashback to finance, but a quick reference reminds us that the difference between total current assets and total current liabilities is known as working capital or net working capital. Working capital are the funds that keep the business running daily. And if working capital is tied up, loaded up in inventory, items sitting on the shelf works in progress, materials waiting to go into the production process, or even finished goods waiting for demand to catch up, then they're limiting their liability and their liquidity, excuse me. They're limiting the amount of money they have to operate the business. It makes managing inventory across every phase of the supply chain a huge priority for most companies. Some firms keep it lean. We're hearing a lot about lean inventory practices right now. You know, they're leveraging those business and those process improvement methodologies we discussed earlier. They're keeping less inventory because they have a just-in-time practice. There are reasons such as keeping safety stock or materials that a company needs to mitigate supplier risk. And that's something that we're seeing more and more focus and investment in. Another important concept here is inventory turnover. You know, how fast are they going through that inventory? And that brings around that conversation about efficiency. So efficiency of a firm directly impacts their working capital cycle, or the amount of time it takes to turn their net current assets and current liabilities into cash. The longer that cycle is, the longer a business has tied up capital in working capital and they're not earning a return. I mean, at a bare minimum, it could be in a savings account making 2%, right? So that's tied up and they're not able to reinvest. Why is that important? It's important to a firm optimizing their supply chain to take into account strategic sourcing partners, to take into account, you know, what the financial environment is like and where they operate. And increases in working capital available allow for reinvestment, you know, and feeding that cash cycle that a firm needs to operate. I think it's one of the most misunderstood things about the supply chain, and it's especially relevant as we talk about risk and resiliency now. You hear rumors of reshoring, and you watch firms start to stockpile materials, many in response to traumatic experiences during COVID. You know, this pendulum will swing the other way, and it's where we can highlight North Carolina's supply chain ecosystem. Its efficiency, its reliable transportation ensures that suppliers can deliver on time. They can deliver affordably. The broader supply base itself can provide many firms in many sectors with redundancy in sourcing. I mean, who doesn't want more cash, right? Doing business in North Carolina can help a firm keep liquidity strong, and our whole state will benefit from their reinvestment. So I know that's a long story about working capital, but if you understand at the core of what a lot of these manufacturing firms are looking for, it's a great way to position North Carolina as yet again, a place to do business, a benefit to their growth and their sustainability. All right, we're getting into that last phase. We're getting close to the customer, close to the end user, and that is with distribution and warehousing. Here's an overview of this shipping process. You know, in this case, we have maritime supply chain and the manufacturing to customer delivery process. In both, we'll discuss this step, which can be one of the most costly activities a company undertakes, but it can also provide a competitive advantage. You know, you've got your warehousing, your freight handling. But let's start with demand. The demand side economics here are much more of the demand, drive a lot of the demand for distribution and warehouse network design. Customer expectations drive those distribution and warehouse network design. And as you can see, and I'm sure we're completely a part of culturally, those expectations are growing, you know, focused on more free and fast shipping. Compliments of Amazon Prime customers now expect free shipping. They also expect it to be fast. This means distribution networks have to adapt. In this bottom diagram, I especially like how this illustrates the proliferation of distribution centers to suit customer demand and expectation. It looks like the United States has measles, but as those measles perpetuate, you know, you're getting faster delivery of that product. On the other side, you're seeing a lot of inventory. So it gets back to that working capital. One area where Amazon's business model continues to be a disruptor. If we look at network design based on what level of service a company can offer, because the service-related and service-oriented supply chain is real and is a real benefit for North Carolina's overall ecosystem. If we look at what they can offer those end users, we have to take into account travel times and distances, And much like that measled map of the United States, here are two examples of how limiting and costly an environment this creates for distribution. This first map is a 2-hour delivery window for the newish, I think we're all familiar with it at this point, Amazon DC right here in Raleigh area in Garner. Then we move to the hypothetical example of a grocery delivery firm. So you see where they can reach. This is where they can operate within that time. Let's take this hypothetical grocery delivery firm. They want to serve areas within a 1-hour delivery window. That's their customer expectation. Efficient network design can make products like this 1-hour delivery possible. They'd need to have 2 locations in this case, just to sort of extrapolate. Alternatively, we're seeing repurposing of facilities for distribution and fulfillment versus construction of new facilities. And this is something to watch as you start to see shopping malls and retail stores and grocery stores become mini fulfillment centers. I won't dive too much into this, but I wanted to give you guys some stats and perspective really on this. So much of the dynamics in the commercial real estate market are changing. And this is something that I think you're quite familiar with if you're more involved in your site selection process and in that phase of recruiting. For some, that real estate availability, you've got warehouse space, you've got square footage available. That is going to be a big draw in the first place. So I'll share this with you, and I'll leave this with you just to give you an idea of how quickly the shift has been away from building new retail space and really adapting to how the marketplace operates. We looked at the measled map. That means smaller warehouses. You used to have the hub and spoke model where you had one large distribution center that served 5 or 6 states. Those days are gone. This graph shows kind of the disparity in capital investment for smaller warehouses. Smaller, closer to the customer, in the urban environment. I couldn't get these into one graph, but you can tell the concentration is clear from 2015 through 2019. And this is a trend I'm 100% confident we'll continue to see. And one to consider as you engage with consumer products or retail adjacent sectors when you recruit, something to keep in mind. All right, I hope everybody's doing well. I'm not seeing any chat. And I know I'm a fast talker, but hopefully we'll get, you catch your breath here. We're gonna jump into one of my favorite things, and that is know your mode. We're gonna talk about how things get from here to there and what's good, what's bad, what's indifferent. Let's look at this matrix of different modes of transportation and their strengths, their weaknesses, and really what they do in the whole supply chain transportation mix. In transportation, the driving factors, often with an inverse relationship, are cost and time. One of the most relevant advantages for trucking are the economics at play. More than $6,700 billion worth, or about 9,200 million tons, or these numbers just are overwhelming. Half the weight, or more than 1/3 the value of goods, were moved less than 100 miles between origin and destination in 2018. And you'll see that the economics here make sense when you think about that. We look at a conceptual representation of cost for each mode. Efficiency and economies of scale are the best things going for maritime shipping and rail, while speed and flexibility improve with trucking and air cargo. And of course, as a friend of my father always said, it costs to be sporty. You want to move things fast, you're going to pay a lot of money. A troubling trend we're watching in the broader supply chain is total logistics costs. I talked a little bit about landed costs earlier, or really what it costs to bring something in across the dock. They're rising, and a host of reasons there, including industry consolidation, capacity challenges in the trucking sector, something we mentioned, firms carrying larger inventories. They got burned during the COVID, peak of COVID crunch, and so they're carrying more inventory now. 2021 remains uncertain with COVID recovery, and I expect we'll continue to see larger inventory levels as companies stock up and ensure their supply chain and assembly lines keep moving. If we look at this particular trend, many will ask, is additional investment in public capital, in particular highway infrastructure, will that help reduce costs? And I'll give you the business school answer is, well, it depends. You know, regardless, this is a question, and it's a conversation that we should be having as we move forward, as we plan and prioritize how we invest in the future infrastructure that supports this logistics and supply chain ecosystem. That's a place where the voice of economic development and the awareness of what's going on in the transportation investment program is so vital, and one that I'd love to see the relationship we have with NCEDA, with regional and local developers, with EDPNC. In North Carolina, the sort of largest and most relevant mode, with 86% of all freight moved by trucks. That's the 800-pound gorilla of transportation. And whether you're on Team Kong or Team Godzilla, you know, this is a critical mass, which is not changing quickly. Nationally, trucks continue to carry the highest percentage of goods by weight and value, transporting 11.3 billion tons, or about 60% of the value of freight. And that status from 2018, I'm sure it's increased in value at least. Some important factors facing trucking is congestion on highway and freight bottlenecks. Many times this is often due to urban passenger traffic or construction, but this is a cost that hits trucking firms. It hits commercial enterprise. It's something that we track regularly at DOT, and you can see a chart of the sort of 2020 to give you an idea of what it looked like against what might be a normal, we'll call normal year of 2019. But again, it essentially shows that shift we saw where congestion costs went down, but they're on their way back up. In 2020, we had, you know, over $1.2 billion of cost of trucks and commercial vehicles delayed, the amount of time they spent delayed in congestion on our roadways. And that's on our priority freight network, which is largely your larger roads, your interstates, your key state freight routes. I think it's important to know what we're talking about and see what we're talking about, and you'll see it all over the place, but now you'll go out there better informed. You'll see we've got dry vans, flatbeds, truckers call flatbeds skateboards. So if you want to look cool at the truck stop, tankers, reefers, that is a truck not moving what you might think, but that's a refrigerated container, and the parlance of transportation is that it's a reefer. You can see the little genset, that little refrigerator right behind the cab. Intermodal, they're moving a container, you know, a shipping container that goes between modes. And lastly, a box truck, and this is perhaps the most ubiquitous in our local and regional ecosystem. There's 13 classifications. This really gets into the nitty-gritty, but it gives you an idea of, in our transportation space, all of the wide spectrum of potential freight we are trying to accommodate. And it doesn't hurt to know, you know, does your recruited company have a heavy freight distribution profile? Are they using a lot of, you know, 11 and 12 and 13 grade vehicles that would have to require special permitting and special consideration? The more you know your customer, you know, that recruit, and the more we can arm you with this information, I think the better it works. We love acronyms, and in trucking, you've got 3 prevalent acronyms: FTL, full truckload; LTL, less than a truckload; and then PTL, partial truckload. So pretty self-explanatory, but now you know when you hear those thrown around what they represent. Chad is asking if we see automation or self-driving trucks affecting the need for additional road infrastructure. Yes, I think it's going to require adaptation of the infrastructure that's out there, something you're already seeing, more focus on well-painted lines and barriers, high visibility for a lot of sort of the AI reading that you see in some of these programs and technologies. So yes, and that's a short answer to what's probably a long answer out there. North Carolina is blessed with a robust and healthy railroad system. You know, from Class 1 railroads, CSX and Norfolk Southern, to the broad range of short lines. Freight fluidity on rail in North Carolina is strong. A 2019 for a Class 1 railroad is an operating revenue in excess of $504 million. So in North Carolina, we have Class 1s, but there are also regional short line railroads And in North Carolina, we have a robust network of short line railroads as well. We have over 20. I'm trying to get this to switch. Yes, so Class 1 railroads were about less than 45% of overall mileage in the United States in 1960. And since then has shrunk, but the freight rail ton miles, the amount of freight moving on that network, has tripled to 1.7 trillion during that same period. Rail moved approximately 1.6 billion tons, valued at over $613 billion in 2019, a lot of which originates in rural America. So as we talk about economic development in the rural environment, rail is a very important mode and one which you can brag on in North Carolina. And here's just some idea of some of the things moving, where they're moving from. Top origins and top destinations. Keep an eye out, the North Carolina statewide rail report will be out soon. They're in the process of finishing that. That's going to be a great resource, something that we'll share with you. We have outstanding passenger rail service. If you think about workforce mobility, that's a big factor. And we work hard to continue to do that. And in fact, you've got Charlotte Gateway Station, something that'll be a really important connection to that relationship between the Raleigh, North Carolina, Raleigh and Charlotte. Service should open in 2024, so we're excited about that. This is something we're talking a lot about. It's the CCX Carolina Connector facility, the intermodal rail facility, open now in Rocky Mount. There's a conceptual view, but if you look at the map, that's where they go all over the place, right from where we are. I've got a couple of pictures, compliments of CSX and OPI and the folks at Carolina's Gateway Partnership. Cranes are in, cranes are running. And that takes us into sort of an economic development conversation around rail. I'm bragging on the home folks here, but we are probably one of the more business and economic development focus groups here at NCDOT and rail. And the Rail Industrial Access Program, or programs like FRIXI, Freight Rail, I'm going to mess up the acronym. The Freight Rail and Rails Crossing Safety Improvement Program, those are opportunities to leverage state capabilities and flow through federal funding to grow business and industry capabilities here in North Carolina. And, funding always depends on if the industry is making its decision to relocate or expand. There's often matching funds from private and local sources required. But again, those programs are out there, and your familiarity with them will arm you to have those conversations. Up next, let's move quickly to where North Carolina remains forever first in flight, as our friends in aviation say. 72 public airports, 10 commercial service, and 62 general aviation facilities, 300 privately owned airports. This is a very strong and very well covered aviation ecosystem in North Carolina. Air carriers move almost exclusively more high value, low weight products. And this is underscored by what we call a value to weight ratio of nearly $99,000 per ton of air cargo versus the average of all modes, which would be about $1,000 per ton. North Carolina ranks 16th among states in total air freight cargo moved each year. More than 1.1 million tons worth, more than $23 billion. So this is a major part of our ecosystem here as well. And we rank 8th in the country for employment in air freight services. If you're working with a company that has a lot of inputs from overseas and is working on making sure they have supply chain resiliency, they're going to want to know that they have outstanding air cargo service. I'll share these slides with you so you have an idea a little bit of where things are going, where they're coming from, and just some great stats for aviation. I'll also make sure that you guys have sort of, here's a breakdown, and we talked a little bit briefly, sort of why air freight is a benefit and why it's an important part of that portfolio. We talk about cargo weight a lot, but in aviation, you also have to think about dimensions. And so with limited space on a plane, light, bulky cargo can dimension out or dim out, and that heavy stuff gets really expensive. Just as we'll see in the maritime sector, a trend growing in trucking, fuel surcharges, those kinds of things are adding to the cost. So whether it's size and weight or the long list of surcharges being added to the cost of moving, those kinds of things are complicating the cost of air freight as it is in other modes. There's a range of services in air freight, including the big one, charter air cargo. You know, if you've had a chance to see the Antonov land at North Carolina Global Transport, they're out there to pick up fuselages from Spirit Air. You know, you can appreciate the scale and perhaps the cost of this option. Here's just some great stats that I'll leave with you from an outstanding report done right here, the State of Aviation wrapped up last year. And I'll make sure that you guys have a link to this. This has just an outstanding collection of information and some resources for you as economic developers. Nancy's asking, with consumers demanding goods sooner, do you anticipate autonomous drones factoring into future port operations for how North Carolina moves goods? Yes, I do. I think that drones are going to be a part of the overall portfolio, and we'll find where they fit the niche. They fit in areas where you need quick delivery, light cargo. We're seeing them deployed in the medical space in facilities like Wake Med, you know, here in Raleigh, or I believe in Winston-Salem, they have a hospital complex running regular drone deliveries of medical equipment. So yes, it will have to fit the niche of cost versus, you know, benefit, and the kinds of cargo it serves and the kind of range it has. All right, keep going there. Let's get into my favorite. I'm an old maritime guy. I keep my North Carolina Ports container on my desk. And with as much volume as 1,000 plus Boeing 747s, you know, we're talking about major container shipping volume. You can ship large volumes at low costs. A freight forwarder can consolidate consignments and reduce costs again. Shipping containers can be used beyond to road or rail. You'll find that it's more than 50% cheaper than air, and that sounds great to me, especially if we're thinking about the added list of costs and fees. So many benefits to, you know, reduction in carbon footprint as we start to see carriers focus on cleaner fuels or operational practices that reduce the carbon footprint of container shipping. There are some drawbacks, you know, slower than other modes. Fuel and security surcharges, like in aviation, are starting to factor in. And really, you could be delayed. I mean, that's the panic we're seeing from the West Coast with 100 ships, and that's sort of the conversation we're having around supply chain delay. Confusing and complicated pricing, that might be the tip of the iceberg there, but I'll tell you, I think with technology's introduction, you'll start to see a lot of that make more sense and be more accessible. Some of the benefits of maritime shipping, you know, capacity, and there's a great shot from the Port of Wilmington, give you an idea of kind of the scale of operations in North Carolina. Lots of kinds of container shipping, or excuse me, of maritime shipping. Containerized, which we talk about the most, but then there's also bulk, you know, bulk cargo, whether it's coal or grain, break bulk, things that are on pallets, like rubber coming in and out of the facility at Morehead City. Tankers, so you've got oils or fuel or slurry. Barge containers, barge or bulk or container. RO-RO, one of my favorite acronyms, that's the roll on, roll off, where you'll see large. There it goes. Okay, I was waiting for my pictures to catch up. Here you go. You've got sort of bulk containers here, fuel tanker, the barge service that you'll see, and the RO-RO, the roll on, roll off, and getting complicated. You know, we're talking a lot about wind power, out of gauge project cargo, and those are things that we're capable of in North Carolina. With the Port of Wilmington, you know, you've got both container bulk and break bulk services with 6 post-Panamax cranes able to work the largest vessels on the East Coast. And with the growth and activity we've seen in Wilmington is a testament, I think, to the priority our state is putting on growing these ports and the outstanding leadership we have at the helm at NC Ports. And I'm not just saying that because they sponsor this, but we love working with the folks at NC Ports. And as an economic developer, if you're not engaged with the port to learn more about them, to have their support and to be engaged with them, you know, it's a great team and a great part of your team in that economic development recruit. I won't spend too much time, but you'll have some of these details. Again, capabilities of the ports in North Carolina provides a diverse set of options for a firm manufacturing or operating here. And that means costs are reduced or at least more competitive, something that you can continue to position North Carolina for. One of the sort of last modes that's important in the industrial conversation is pipelines. You know, in 2018, a more recent stat, we're talking about $3.3 billion worth of goods, mostly crude oil, petroleum products, and natural gas. There are more than 190,000 miles of liquid petroleum pipelines in the United States, and 70% of crude oil moves by pipeline. So this is important to North Carolina. You see where those cross our state. You know, if you have access to natural gas at a facility, that's a draw for a site selector and something that you need to know, and something you know how to position. So I know I plowed through that last thing. I started to see that I was in the 1050s. I promised to make a lot of this material available to you to spend some more time with some of the details, the benefits and costs of each mode. And then I'll also be available if you want to spend some time on this. I know we try and cram a lot in. And of course, in a school bell, you know, you guys would all get up and run out as soon as it rings. But I want to tease the third session, something I'm excited that we'll be doing in person at the Port of Wilmington in November. I'd like to take the conversation beyond manufacturing, which you've heard so much of, and talk about supply chain in context of agriculture, energy, finance, the other areas of the state economy that are not just tangential, but that are really interwoven with the supply chain. We'll talk a little bit about e-commerce. You know, that's something that's quite popular and very relevant. We'll talk a little bit about North Carolina's organizations and the resources for supply chain development. You know, I like to think that at NCDOT, we're engaged to support economic development, you know, in our area of the supply chain. And you see commerce, you see EDPNC, you see NCEDA, local organizations, environment, DEQ. All of these organizations work so well together in North Carolina that we have to brag on that when we talk about coming and doing business here in North Carolina or growing your business already here. We'll talk about future change agents in the supply chain, and I'll try and get a little bit of time while we're there to talk about sustainability. I think that that's something you'll see more and more of, not just in the context of environmental sustainability, but operational supply chain sustainability. So there we are. I know we're right at 11 almost. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also here. I can provide my contact information there, which I know that Liz will share with the group. Let's see. All right. Do we lose everybody? Are we still there?
Dana, I just wanted to thank you, and any presentation that includes Art Vandelay and a Seinfeld references is great by me. And I think we took it up from a G-rated presentation to PG with a learning of what a reefer truck is. So appreciate it.
Now you know for sure. You know, when I first started in maritime, I had to quickly adapt.
Well, I did want to thank you, and thanks again to our presenting sponsor, North Carolina State Port Authority. I'm trying to wait and see if there's any questions that roll in.
Sure.
But I think we're up at our hour time frame.
I'm happy to stay on if folks want to talk as well. I've got a little bit of time.
Great. I like it.
Dana, I might have missed it. This is Emily from NCEDA.
Yes, ma'am.
Were you able to answer the question about drones from the Q&A?
Yes,
Okay,
and
awesome.
the short answer is if they fit into the operations and the costs and the benefits, that they'll be deployed. Any technology that you see that has those benefits, I think always gets integrated quickly into industry. One thing we talked about on the first go round was blockchain, talking about distributed ledger technology. Is that going to hit? Yes, it's hitting. And where is it hitting? It's hitting in industry, where utilization and saving costs and efficiencies, those are the key drivers. So I think the answer to that is drones, yes. Technologies, yes. Autonomy, yes.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate it. Before we let everybody go, a few closing announcements. Our supply chain series concludes next month in person. Dana mentioned this. It's going to be in Wilmington. So mark your calendars for the final installment on November 16th at the Hotel Ballast, and that was formerly known as the Hilton Riverside, followed by a tour at the Port of Wilmington. So please mark your calendars for that and make plans to attend. Also note that December 2nd is our annual networking luncheon in Raleigh. So plan to join us at the City Club for great food, networking, and update from state leaders on important topics of talent and workforce development. And in the meantime, we thank everyone for being with us today. We know it's a valuable resource to try to share some of this information on logistics and supply chain, but we value your time. So until we see you again, stay connected, stay confident, and stay well. Thank you very much.